Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We've seen a lot of fighting and a lot of developments taking place over the past 24 hours. That in the Avdiivka direction alone, according to Ukrainian sources, there's been 50 battles taking place throughout the past 24 hours. However, we do start in the direction of Bilorivka, where the Russians, according to this geolocated footage, has managed to make an advance in the direction of the east of Bilorivka, where fighting is taking place over the industrial zone here to the east of the village. And with this, we see that the Russians have now gained a proper foothold within it. They prior to this advancement had a foothold, but it has now been expanded with further control over the area. And with this, we see that there is continuous efforts by the Russians to continue advancing in this sector of the front line. We then move further south to the Bakhmut section of the front, where the Russians have made two advancements. The first one is here by the forest patch to the north of Klishchiivka, where they've managed to gain a proper foothold within the forest lines. After advancing into it, they have then expanded down south and captured these parts, and with that they have gained control over most of this forest patch. With the final parts, if the Russians manage to advance and capture the final parts, then the northern section of Klishchiivka would be firmly under the Russian control, and with that they could launch further offensive operations in a western direction in an attempt of cutting off the Ukrainian positions south of Klishchiivka, or they could also move in a northern direction towards Novomykhailivka and expand the front line control in that direction. We see that there are multiple forest lines here to the south of Novomykhailivka, which the Russians could have an interest in capturing to try and hit the Ukrainian supply lines going from the north down to the south. But this could also be an attempt to move slowly with small assault groups towards the village to try and get better positions prior to an assault towards it. And we may also see further advances by the Russians here west of Bakhmut, where they'll try to capture the forest lines here, again with small assault groups likely to gain better positions prior to storming the Ivanyivska area. Following this, we move on to the Avdiivka direction, where we here see a lot of developments. Starting out in the south, we see that the Russians have managed to recapture the final parts of the streets as the Ukrainian counterattack failed after continuous fighting, and the Russians managed to hold on and deflect that counterattack. And with that, we see that there is continuous efforts by both sides to change the situation here to the south of Avdiivka, and this is where the majority of the 50 battles took place. First off, we have Ukrainian attempts in the southwest of Avdiivka to regain control over the military base here in this part. So we see that the Ukrainians are attempting to launch counterattacks and here try to regain control of it. As we see, the majority of the fortifications are to the south of the base. As such, the northern parts are vulnerable, and it will be much easier for the Ukrainians to recapture it than it was for the Russians to capture it. However, we do see that the fighting is taking place, and so far the Ukrainians have been unsuccessful in recapturing it. The main reason the Russians managed to capture it was due to Ukrainian withdrawal from the area, after which we saw geolocated footage of Russians capturing a few soldiers that were left behind. And with that, we saw that the Russians had gained control of it. And since then, fighting has taken place as the Ukrainians realized that the situation wasn't as bad as they thought it was, and therefore they now are using efforts and, after the arrival of reinforcements, trying to regain control of it. As for the central parts here with the Russian advances in the middle, we see that the Russians are trying to expand in every direction. In the northeastern direction in the Syedova Street, where the Russians are trying to expand in a northeastern direction and bypass the Ukrainian defenses here in the center and to disrupt the Ukrainian counterattacks here to the southeast. In the western direction, to try and get a control of the Dacha area here to the southwest of Avdiivka, where we see that the Ukrainian forces have multiple fortifications both to the south and to the west of it, but also that they have a significant presence here, which allows the Ukrainians here to act as a thorn in the side of the Russian advances. As long as the Ukrainians have presence here, the Russians cannot solidify the control over the residential area here to the southwest of Avdiivka, and with that the Ukrainians will continue to hold on to this area, and the Russians are attempting to regain control of it. As for the central parts, the Ukrainians are attempting to bypass the Russian control over southwest Avdiivka and mainly focus on the Sarkauhota direction. If the Ukrainians manage to gain control of that, then they would just need to focus on the pipe here to the southeast, and that is why we're seeing that the Ukrainians are attacking here to the southeast as well as to the southwest, trying to cut off the main road, as well as trying to get to the base of the pipe. So the Ukrainians actually have to go all the way down here, or simply take control over the area of the residential area to end the Russian connection with the pipe that goes through. That's why the importance of this pipe didn't end with the Russian sneak attack and subsequent capture over the residential area, but instead it is still important as a supply line in and out of Avdiivka. It allows Russian soldiers to move through without being under fire from Ukrainian artillery, and they also have the ability of moving smaller equipment across, such as ATGM systems. So with this pipe, the Russians can essentially just move back and forth, even if the Ukrainians recapture Serka-Ohota. But with the control of Serka-Ohota, the Russians could also just move equipment through the main road. This is why there's a lot of fighting over Serka-Ohota and subsequently in a southeastern direction. However, if the Ukrainians want to stop the influx of troops through this pipe, they could either go down and get to the source of the pipe, but that would be through a lot of trenches and fortifications, so that is fairly unreasonable. They're likely just trying to recapture the Dacha area if the Russians do not have proper control over it yet. But there's also the fact that if the Ukrainians gain control over the exit of the pipe, then they would be able to stop influx of troops going through there as well. As for the northeastern parts of Avdiivka, we saw a small Russian advance here to the northeast, where they managed to gain control over further parts of this field. With this geolocated footage, we see that the Russians are continuously attempting to make some advancements and movements here to the northeast of Avdiivka, and this is the other part of the 50 battles taking place within Avdiivka, as Russians are trying to expand their control here to the northeast, where they are trying to gain control over the Dacha areas and move down south to flank the Ukrainian positions in the northeast. And expanding the front to 2 fronts for Avdiivka makes it very vulnerable, especially with the limited supply that can go through Avdiivka. We then move on to the final sector of the front line that we'll be discussing in this video. We see 2 Ukrainian advances and 1 Russian advance. First off, here to the southwest of Novomykhailivka, the Ukrainians launched a counterattack, allowing them to regain positions here in the fields to the southwest of Novomykhailivka. And with this, the Ukrainian pressure continues to exceed here to the southwest. We see that the Russians have been attempting to gain further control, allowing them to expand and bypass Novomykhailivka to the south, as well as gain positions closer to the road between Instensifies and Uledar to try and get direct fire control of it. But the Ukrainians noticed this advancements and managed to regain some position by launching counterattacks, as they realized the importance of holding the Russians away from the road. At the same time, we also see that the northern parts of Novomykhailivka, we're seeing some back and forth between the Ukrainians and the Russians, where the Ukrainians managed to advance in the north and the Russians in the south, as they tried to advance in each of their own sections, which leave the other part vulnerable, and as such, both sides managed to make an advancement. So we're seeing continuous assault groups by both the Russians and the Ukrainians trying to advance, and whichever has the advantages, whichever manages to shoot the most artillery at those opponents. With the Ukrainians having a lack of artillery, they are choosing their targets carefully, while the Russians having an abundance of it allows them to shoot much more in comparison. And that is all of the territorial changes. We then move on to this article by the Washington Post, where they have this exclusive where the U.S. war plans, which the Biden administration is working on for a long-term strategy, does not include a Ukrainian offensive in 2024. According to this post, the Biden administration, the United States, is attempting to make a deal that they want to pass through Congress for a build-up of Ukrainian forces and strengthening of their defenses through 2024, so that in 2025 they can launch an offensive. The main reason for this is that they realized the Russian defensives were very strong and they needed a much stronger force, and there's the delay with the F-16 fighter jets and so on. So all of these things makes it difficult for the Ukrainians to launch an offensive in 2024, especially with the failure of the Ukrainian offensive in 2023, which gained no results, but instead ended up losing a lot of their offensive capabilities. So with that, they are deciding on a long-term strategy where they're trying to build up their forces through 2024, not launch any major offensives, and just try to have a stronger Ukraine by the end of the year. Meanwhile, the fact that a US election is taking place in 2024 has not gone ahead unnoticed. As such, we see that the US or the Biden administration is also planning a what they call a Trump-proof plan. So the point is that the Biden administration is attempting that this package goes through with the fact that the $60 billion is aimed at giving the Ukrainians everything they need prior to Trump being elected. And as such, they would be able to have this sort of offensive capability by the end of 2024 and at the start of 2025, regardless of whether or not Trump or Biden wins or loses the election. And that is that for the article. We see that the Ukrainians are trying to get some sort of deal through with the United States that allows them to launch an offensive in 2025. But this requires that the Ukrainians will have a successful 2024 in defense. This means that the Ukrainians need to avoid taking as many casualties as possible, and they would have to give up territory. However, so far we're seeing that the Ukrainians are rather focusing on holding their territory despite the recent developments. As a very famous quote that is attributed to Mao Zedong, keep men, lose land, land can be taken again. Keep land, lose men, land and men are both lost. If you have an army of 500,000 soldiers, you hold the front line while you're trying to build up your forces. Instead, you're trying to hold the line at all costs. That ends up costing a lot of military personnel. If those military personnel cannot be recuperated over the period of time that you're trying to hold on for, then you'll end up having less men, and therefore you'll have a more difficult time of continuing the fight, and you'll likely lose more land due to a weakened military. But if you in turn keep withdrawing whenever the situation becomes difficult, then you can save men's lives. And if you have a stronger military at the end of the time that you're trying to hold on for, then you'll be able to continue the war and possibly retake more territory as you now have a stronger army. So while the Ukrainian plan right now is to build up their forces to 2025 so they can attempt a new offensive in 2025, they are still holding on to the territory at the front, which causes them to lose men. Instead of moving to a more adaptable and defensive position similar to the Russians, what the Russians did, the Russians gave up land, but they kept their men. And that is why we're seeing now that the Russians are able to hold on and have built up a much stronger army that they're able to fight the Ukrainians with. But the Ukrainians are not doing the same, as we can see so far. They're holding on to Avdiivka at all costs. They're even sending reinforcements to counterattack just to keep the land. And that is going to be their biggest mistake of the war. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.